There is a letter I have thought about every single day for 75 years. I never read it. My father made sure of that. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I'm not a woman who complains. I have buried a husband. I have buried 2 children. I have worked a farm from before sunrise to after dark, and I have done it without complaint, because that is what was asked of me, and I have always done what was asked of me. But this one thing has never left me. I want to tell you about a letter. But to tell you about the letter, I have to tell you about the house I grew up in. And to tell you about that house, I have to tell you about my father. Let me start earlier. Let me start where I think it all started. I was 5 years old the first time I saw someone write a word on a piece of paper and then read it back. My mother was writing a list. Flour, salt, dried beans, thread, things we needed from the dry goods store in town. She wrote each word slowly, her lips moving just a little as the pencil moved across the paper. Then she read it back to me, pointing at each word as she said it. I remember standing beside her chair and feeling something I cannot explain. It was not wonder exactly. It was more like recognition. Like I was seeing something I had always known existed but had never been shown before. I asked her what the squiggles meant. She laughed a little. Not a big laugh, my mother never laughed big. And she said each squiggle was a sound, and sounds made words, and words made sentences, and sentences made letters, and letters could carry a thought from one person to another even after the person who wrote them was dead and buried. I thought about that for a very long time. A thought that could live past the person who thought it. I had never heard anything so extraordinary in all my 5 years of life. We were not a wealthy family, but we were not poor. Not poor the way some families were poor. The kind of poor where children go to bed cold and hungry. We had a farm of about 40 acres and my father worked it hard. We had 2 cows, a small herd of hogs, chickens, a kitchen garden my mother tended, and 3 fields my father plowed by hand in the early years before we had a proper draft horse. We had enough. But enough was all we had, and my father was the kind of man who considered enough to be all that God required of a person. His name was Thomas Dunn. Born in 1811, the son of an Irish immigrant who had come over with nothing and built something through discipline, fear of God, and the willingness to work until his hands bled. My grandfather Dunn had passed before I was born. I knew him only through stories. But the shape of him was everywhere in our house. In the way my father held himself. In the silences at the supper table. In the way the Bible sat at the center of everything. There were 4 of us children. I was the second born. My brother William was 3 years older than me, born in 1840, and he was my father's son in every way that mattered. Quiet, hard, not given to dreaming. Then there was me. Then my sister Catherine, born in 1846. Who was gentler than William but wiser in ways I did not understand until we were older. And then the youngest, my brother James, born in 1849, who died of typhoid fever when he was 7 years old in the summer of 1856. James was the one my mother cried for. But we will come to that. The farm sat in a shallow valley between 2 low hills. There was a creek about a quarter mile to the east that flooded badly in spring and dried to almost nothing in August. The house itself was 2 rooms downstairs and 1 room above. Not a grand house but a solid one, built by my grandfather and added to by my father. The floors were plank. The fireplace was the center of warmth in winter. There was a small cast-iron stove in the kitchen that my mother cooked on, and the smell of that stove, iron and wood smoke and whatever was in the pot, is one of the earliest things I remember. I loved that farm in the way you love the place where you were born. The way you love something not because you chose it but because it chose you. But I always knew, even as a small child, that I was meant for something that farm could not give me. I just did not know yet that knowing that was dangerous. I want to be fair to my father. I have spent a great many years being unfair to him, and I think fairness is something I owe, if not to him then to the truth. Thomas Dunn was not a cruel man in the way that some men are cruel. He did not drink. He did not raise his hand to us children, not even once that I can remember. He fed us and clothed us and kept a roof above our heads when other men in the county were losing their farms to debt and bad harvests. He read to us from the Bible every evening without fail, his big rough hands holding the book carefully, like he was afraid he might damage it. He loved God the way some men love a commanding officer, with complete obedience and without question. And he genuinely believed down to the bottom of his soul, that God had made a clear and specific order for things. Men worked the land. Women kept the home. Children obeyed. The Bible said what it said, and what it said was final. And if you did not understand why the Bible said what it said, That was because you were not meant to understand, you were meant to obey. That was the law of our house. Not written anywhere, but as firm and real as the plank floor beneath our feet. He was a tall man, 6 feet and a little more. His hands were enormous, rough and cracked from years of work, with dirt embedded in the creases that soap and water never fully removed. He smelled of hay and soil and sometimes pipe tobacco, though he only smoked his pipe on Sundays as a small concession to pleasure. His hair was dark when I was young and went gray in the early 1860s, during the war years when the worrying aged him fast. He did not talk a great deal. That was the thing about my father. He had a great many opinions, but he expressed most of them through silence. A certain kind of silence that meant approval. A different kind that meant disapproval. And one particular silence, deep and still and cold, that meant the matter was decided and there was to be no further discussion. I learned to read his silences the way you learn to read the sky before a storm. My mother's name was Hannah. Hannah née Cooper before she became Hannah Dunn. She was born in 1816 and was 23 years old when she married my father. She was small where he was large, quiet in a different way, quiet from tenderness rather than from authority. She had gone to school for 2 years as a girl, which was more than many women of her generation, and she could read and write adequately, though she did not do either often. She was the one who wrote the shopping list I told you about. She was the one who explained to me that letters could carry a thought past the death of the person who thought it. I do not think she knew what she set in motion when she said that to me. The question of school was complicated in our household. My brother William attended school, a one-room schoolhouse about 2 miles down the road, which served children from 6 surrounding farms. He went for 4 winters, which was considered sufficient for a boy who would farm. He learned to read passably and to do arithmetic, and my father considered his education complete. When I turned 6, I asked my father if I could go to school too. He looked at me for a long moment, that long still look of his. Then he said, "Girls learn what they need to learn at home." That was all he said. He did not raise his voice. He did not explain further. The matter was decided. I did not cry. I had already learned by age 6 that crying in front of my father was pointless. My mother taught me letters at home. Secretly, I think, though not hidden from my father exactly, more the way women in that time did many things quietly in the margins, in the moments between what was required of them. She taught me the alphabet at the kitchen table on winter evenings while my father was mending harness in the barn. She used the Bible mostly. She would point to a word and tell me what sound it made, and over time the sounds added up to words, and the words added up to something I could follow on the page. By the time I was 8, I could read the Psalms without difficulty. By 9, I was reading everything my mother owned. 3 books, a handful of old newspapers, the almanac, and the Bible itself from beginning to end. I was hungry for it in a way I could not explain to anyone. Not because I had been told reading was important, but because each word I learned felt like a door opening onto a room I had not known existed. My father knew I could read. He did not forbid it entirely. The Bible was permissible. A girl who knew her scripture was, in his view, less likely to stray from the path God had set for her sex. But books, other books, books of learning, books of geography and history and grammar, those were different. Those were not for women. Not because my father had thought carefully about why, but because it had never been done, and what had never been done was what God intended not to be done. That was his logic. And in our house his logic was law. There was a woman named Mrs. Clara Holloway. She came to teach at the Millbrook Schoolhouse in the autumn of 1852, when I was 9 years old. She was, I believe, 24 or 25 at the time, a young woman from Lancaster who had completed a normal school course and received a certificate to teach. She was not married when she arrived, though she married a local farmer named Holloway 2 years after she came to us, which was why she gave up her teaching position, because in those years, a married woman was not permitted to teach. The school board would not have it. A married woman's place was with her husband. That was simply understood. But for those 2 years before her marriage she taught at Millbrook. And she changed my life. Or rather, she showed me what my life could have been. Which is not the same thing and which is, I think, worse. I did not attend her school. My father had made clear that school was not for me. But my brother William was still in attendance in those years, and sometimes on cold mornings my mother would send me to walk William to the schoolhouse and carry his midday meal for him, because William was forgetful and would leave without it. On these mornings I would sometimes arrive before lessons had begun, and I would stand at the open door of the schoolhouse and look in. I can see it now as clearly as I saw it then. It was a single room. 12, perhaps 15 children seated on wooden benches. A black slate board at the front, and Mrs. Holloway standing before it with a piece of chalk in her hand, writing. The smell of chalk dust and wood smoke from the iron stove in the corner. The sound of children reciting in unison. Letters, numbers, the names of states. I stood at that door and felt something pull at me so hard it was almost physical. Like a hand reaching through my chest. One morning Mrs. Holloway saw me standing there. She came to the door and smiled at me. She had a kind face, not soft exactly but warm. She asked my name. I told her. She said she knew my brother William and asked if I had come to deliver his dinner pail. I said yes. She said, "Do you read, Eliza?" I said I could read the Bible. She said, "Would you like to come in for a little while?" I did not tell my father. For 6 weeks that autumn and into early winter, whenever I walked William to school, I stayed. I sat at the back of the room on a bench near the door and I listened. Mrs. Holloway taught me as she taught the others. Numbers, the names of rivers, how to form letters properly on a slate with a stylus, how to spell words I had only ever read and never written. Writing was the thing that astonished me most. Reading was receiving. Writing was sending. And I wanted, more than I had ever wanted anything, to send. To put a thought on paper and give it to someone. To be understood past the moment of speaking. I told my mother. She listened and said nothing for a time. Then she said, "Don't tell your father." So I did not tell my father. William knew. But William was not a boy who talked much, and he did not consider my presence at the school particularly important either way. He was already helping my father in the fields on days when the weather allowed, and school was something he endured rather than valued. Those 6 weeks were the happiest of my childhood. I say that and it sounds like an exaggeration, but I am 89 years old and I am not in the habit of exaggerating. They were simply the best weeks. The weeks when I was most fully myself. When I could feel the shape of who I was and what I wanted clearly without confusion. Mrs. Holloway told me in the 5th week that I was the sharpest student she had taught. She said it quietly, not in front of the others. She said, "You have a mind that wants to work, Eliza. Do not let anyone convince you that is a fault." I have kept those words in my chest for 80 years. Then one afternoon my father came to the schoolhouse. I do not know who told him. I have never known. It may have been a neighboring farmer who saw me walk in and mentioned it to him. It may have been William, though I do not like to think so. It may have been accident. My father passing the road with a load of grain for the mill and looking through the window. He stood in the doorway. He did not speak loudly. He simply said my name. Eliza. I closed the slate. I stood up. I walked out. He did not speak to me until we were off the road and in the fields on our own land. Then he said, "You will not go back." I said, "Yes, Papa." That was all. But something had been lit in me that could not be unlit. He had taken me from the schoolhouse. He could not take away what I had already learned, and he could not take away the wanting. A girl with a wanting like mine is either very lucky or very unlucky, depending on whether anyone in her life is willing to help her. I was unlucky. I was 14 years old in the spring of 1857. By then I had learned as much as I could teach myself. I had read every book in the house. I had read the almanac so many times I could recite crop rotation tables from memory. I had borrowed books from neighbors, quietly, the way you borrow something when you know the borrowing would not be approved, and I had read those too. I had read a geography book that belonged to the Kinsey family up the road, and a collection of letters written by a man who had traveled west, and 2 volumes of sermons, and a dog-eared copy of a novel I will not name because my father would have burned that too if he had known I had it. I was hungry and I was getting hungrier and there was nothing left to eat. You need to understand what was happening in this country in those years, at least in our part of Pennsylvania. The normal school movement, the movement to train women as teachers, had been growing for a decade or more. There were schools in several counties now specifically designed to train girls as teachers for rural schoolhouses. The idea was simple and practical. There were not enough men willing to teach for what the school boards were willing to pay, and women could be paid less, and so women were permitted, encouraged even, to train and teach. It was not progress exactly. Not the way we think of progress now. Women were permitted to teach because it was cheap. But the door was open, and some of us could see through it even if we had not yet been allowed to step through it. Mrs. Holloway, before she left teaching, had written a letter on my behalf. She had done this without telling me. I did not know it until much later. She had written to the Westmoreland County Normal Institute, which trained young women to teach in country schools. She had described me, my age, my situation, my abilities as she had observed them in those 6 weeks at the schoolhouse. She had written, and she told me this herself years later, when I encountered her again by chance at a church gathering, that she had never taught a girl of 14 with my particular quality of attention. That was the phrase she used. Quality of attention. She had asked the institute whether there might be a place available and whether something might be arranged regarding the cost, as my family was of modest means. The letter came in April. I was not home when it arrived. I was in the kitchen garden with my mother, pulling the first early weeds of spring from around the onion sets. My father collected the post himself when he was going to the mill in town. We had no delivery to the farm in those years. You went to collect or you did without. He came home in the afternoon. I did not see him arrive. I was still in the garden. My mother came out to me sometime before supper and said that a letter had come addressed to me. I remember standing up, wiping my hands on my apron, feeling something move through me that I can only describe as premonition, not certainty but possibility. The sense that something was about to change. I said, "Who is it from?" She looked at me in a way I could not fully read. She said, "Your father has it." I went inside. My father was at the kitchen table. The letter was in front of him on the table. He had opened it. This was not unusual. It was his household and his table and everything in it was his, including, in a real and practical sense, me. A letter addressed to his 14-year-old daughter was a letter addressed to his household, and he would have read it without hesitation. He was not angry when I came in. That surprised me. I had expected something on his face, anger or that particular cold stillness that meant displeasure. But his face was simply closed, like a door that has been latched from the inside. He looked at me and then he looked at the letter. He said, "Come and sit down, Eliza." I sat. He pushed the letter across the table toward me without speaking. I picked it up. It was written on good paper, better paper than we used in our house. The letterhead read, Westmoreland County Normal Institute, Greensburg, Pennsylvania. Beneath that, the date, March 28, 1857. I read it. It was addressed to Miss Eliza Dunn. It said that Mrs. Clara Holloway had written on my behalf and had spoken highly of my academic abilities. It said the institute had reviewed her letter and found it compelling. It said there was a place available in the autumn term beginning September 1857, for young women who wished to qualify as country school teachers. It said the term cost $12, but that the institute maintained a small fund for girls of demonstrated ability and limited means, and that on the recommendation of Mrs. Holloway, the institute was prepared to offer me a full scholarship, my tuition, board, and books at no cost to my family, for 1 year of study. It said that upon completion of the course, I would receive a certificate permitting me to teach in any county school in Pennsylvania. At the bottom, in careful handwriting, "We hope you will seriously consider this opportunity, Miss Dunn. Mrs. Holloway speaks of you in the most particular terms, and we believe you would reflect great credit on the institute." I read it twice. Then I looked up at my father. He was watching me with that closed expression. I said, and my voice was careful, "The way you speak when you are very young and very frightened and trying not to let either show." I said, "It is a scholarship, Papa. It would cost you nothing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It would cost me a daughter for a year." I said, "But after that I could earn." He held up one hand. Just the hand. The way he always stopped a conversation that had gone as far as he intended it to go. He said, "A woman who teaches school is a woman who believes her mind is equal to a man's. That is a sin of pride, Eliza. And I will not raise a daughter in sin." I did not speak. I could not speak. There are moments in your life when something is taken from you so cleanly and so completely that you cannot even make a sound. You just sit with the gap where the thing used to be. He folded the letter. He stood up from the table. And he walked to the fireplace. The fire was low that afternoon. It was April and the weather had turned mild. We had not needed much wood for the fireplace in several days. There were a few embers left from the morning fire, still glowing orange at the center of the grate, and a piece of half-burned oak log that had not fully gone out. My father did not say anything else. He simply put the letter into the grate. It did not catch immediately. The fire was too low. He stood there for a moment, his back to me, and I watched the letter lie among the coals and then begin to darken along one edge, and then the first small flame appeared, blue-orange, along the fold. I watched it burn. I want to tell you what that was like. Not the facts of it. The facts are simple: a piece of paper burned, it took perhaps 30 seconds. But what it was like to be 14 years old and sit in a wooden chair at a kitchen table and watch the only door out of your life close and then disappear. The paper turned brown first, then black. The ink went last. I could see the letters of the heading still readable for a moment even as the paper crumbled. Westmoreland County Normal Institute. And then that too was gone, and there was nothing left but ash and a curl of gray smoke that went up the chimney and out into the April air. My father did not look at me when he turned from the fireplace. He said, "The Lord did not intend women for books, Eliza. He made them for the home. You will thank him for it someday." He walked out of the kitchen. I sat at that table for a long time after he left. My mother came in from outside at some point. She looked at the fireplace. She looked at me. She did not say anything. She began to prepare supper, moving quietly around the kitchen, and I sat in my chair and watched her, and I remember thinking this very clearly: she knew this would happen. She knew before she came out to the garden to tell me. I did not blame her. My mother was not a woman who had the power to change what my father decided. No woman in that house did. She had made her own accommodations, her own small hidden places where she kept the parts of herself he did not approve of, and she had survived. She was trying to survive. I could not blame her for it. But I remember the silence of that kitchen. The smell of the supper beginning to cook. My mother's back turned to me. The ash in the grate. I did not cry that evening. Not then. I was 14 years old and I had been raised in a house that did not have much room for tears, and I had already learned to keep the important things inside where they could not be seen. I cried later. Alone. In a room I shared with my sister Catherine after everyone was asleep. I put my face into the straw of my pillow and I cried until I had nothing left in me, and then I stopped. And I lay there in the dark and I thought, this is not the end of it. This cannot be the end of it. But it was the end of it. That is the thing I did not know then that I know now. It was the end of it. There was no other letter. There was no other door. There was only the farm and the years and the life that had been decided for me. I have thought about that letter almost every day since. Not every day out of grief, or not only out of grief. I have thought about it the way you think about a road you were not allowed to walk down. You wonder where it went. You wonder what was at the end of it. Was it everything you imagined, or was it just another ordinary road that would have disappointed you in its ordinary way? I do not know. I will never know. There is something I should tell you that I have never told another living person. That evening, after I had finished crying and before I slept, I made a decision. I decided I was going to learn to write properly. Not just read, I could read well enough. But write. Write with good grammar and correct spelling and in a way that meant what I intended it to mean. I was going to teach myself with whatever I could borrow and whatever I could find, and no one was going to take that from me because there was nothing to take. You cannot burn what is inside a person's head. It was a small decision. A private, underground kind of determination, the kind that women in those years often had to carry underground because there was nowhere safe to carry it in the open. But I kept it. For years I kept it. And it sustained me more than I could have predicted on that April evening with the ash still warm in the grate. I want to say one more thing about my father and the letter. He was not a villain. I know that is a strange thing to say after describing him burning a scholarship letter in front of his 14-year-old daughter. But I have had 75 years to think about Thomas Dunn, and I do not believe he was wicked. I believe he was a man entirely formed by the world he had been given, by his father, by his faith, by the century he was born into, and that it did not occur to him to question any of it. He said the Lord did not intend women for books. I have always wondered about that. I wondered it then and I wonder it still. The Lord made my mind the way he made it. The Lord put in me the wanting that I felt at 5 years old watching my mother write a list of flour and salt. If the Lord made all things, then the Lord made my mind and the Lord made my wanting. Did he make them only to take them away? I asked that question in 1857 and I have not received a satisfactory answer yet. The spring and summer after the letter was burned were the longest months of my young life. I went back to the farm work. There was always farm work. There is no season in farming when the work stops, only seasons when it changes. In spring there was planting. In summer there was weeding and tending and the first cutting of hay. In autumn there would be harvest and preserving and the long labor of putting enough food away to last the winter. I did these things. I did them without complaint. I rose before the sun and worked until dark, and I kept my face smooth and my voice even, and I did not speak about the letter. But inside something had changed. I had been, before that day, a girl who was unhappy about her circumstances but who still believed, somewhere underneath the unhappiness, that circumstances could change. That there was a way. That wanting hard enough might eventually produce something. After the letter, I no longer believed that. I do not mean I gave up. I kept my private determination. The decision I had made lying in the dark that night. The decision to teach myself properly what school would not be permitted to teach me. I kept that. But the believing that things could change openly, officially, with the permission of the people who held authority over me, that I let go of. It was too painful to hold. My father did not speak of the letter again. Not once. For the rest of his life, which extended another 20 years. He died in 1877 at 66, from a congestion of the lungs that took him in 3 weeks. He never mentioned it. Not the scholarship, not Mrs. Holloway, not the Westmoreland County Normal Institute. It was as if it had never existed. And I think for him genuinely it had not. He had made a decision consistent with his understanding of God's order. The matter was resolved. There was nothing to return to. For me it was different. The thing he considered resolved was the thing I could never stop thinking about. My sister Catherine asked me that summer what was wrong. Catherine was 11 years old then, 3 years younger than me, and she was observant in the way that younger sisters sometimes are, watching the older one for information about what life was going to require of them. I said nothing was wrong. She said, "You are different since spring." I said, "People change." She looked at me with that watchful, careful look of hers and did not say anything more. But she knew. I think she knew more than she let on. Catherine was always like that. I spent those months reading everything I could find and practicing my writing in the back of an old account book my mother no longer used. I wrote in small letters to fit more on each page. I copied sentences from the Bible and from the geography book I had borrowed from the Kinseys, and I tried to pay attention to grammar, to how sentences were built. The way a word like because connected two thoughts. The way although set up a contradiction. These things fascinated me. Not just as usefulness but as beauty. The way a sentence could be constructed to do something precise. I could not explain to anyone why this mattered to me. I simply knew that it did. There was one day, I remember it clearly, a wet afternoon in July, when I was sitting in the barn with the account book while the rain came down on the roof, and I had been writing a sentence trying to get it exactly right when I heard my father come in from the field. He passed the barn door. I slid the account book under the hay beside me. He did not come into the barn. He went to the house. But I sat there for a long time after with the book hidden under the hay, and I felt something I was ashamed of. I felt a sharp, cold dislike for him that I had never let myself feel before. Not hatred. I want to be precise about this. It was not hatred. It was the dislike you feel when someone takes something from you carelessly, without understanding what it was, and then walks away as if nothing has happened. He never knew what he burned. He never knew. That, in some ways, was the worst of it. I was married in the spring of 1859, 2 months after my 16th birthday. His name was John Crawford. He was 22 years old, the son of a farmer from the next county over, and he had come to Allegheny County to lease a piece of land from a family called the Moores and start his own operation. He was not a bad man. I want to say that clearly and first because everything that follows needs to be understood with that as its foundation. John Crawford was not a bad man. He was a plain man. A practical man. A man who understood soil and weather and livestock and very little else, and who did not consider the very little else to be a significant deficiency. He worked hard and he was steady and he kept his word and he did not drink more than he could manage. By the measures that mattered in 1859 he was a good match. My father arranged the marriage. That is how it was done in our world at that time. John Crawford's father approached my father and the two men spoke. And then my father came to me and told me that I was to marry John Crawford. I said, "When?" He said, "In April." I said, "Yes, Papa." I did not ask whether I had a choice. I knew I did not. Not because I was a fool or because I was weak, but because I understood the arithmetic of my situation with complete clarity. I was 16 years old, I had no money, I had no certificate, I had no position, I had no way of leaving my father's house except through another man's house. The scholarship had been my one door and it was ash. So I said yes. I said it with my face composed and my voice even, and I held the weight of it inside where I always held the important things. I became Eliza Crawford on the 14th of April 1859. I was 16 years 1 month old. We were married in the church, the same church where I had been baptized, by the minister who had known my family all my life. I remember the day clearly but distantly. The way you remember something that was happening to a version of yourself you are watching from outside. I wore a dress my mother had helped me sew, blue-gray wool, not a fine dress but a good one. John Crawford stood beside me at the front of the church and said his vows in a steady voice and shook my father's hand afterward with the gravity of a man completing a business transaction, which is more or less what it was. We moved to the Crawford farm, John's leased land on the Moore property, 3 miles from my father's house. Far enough to be separate, close enough that I could visit my mother every week or two, which I did faithfully until she died in 1871. The house was small, smaller than my father's. 2 rooms only with a sleeping loft above. John had built much of it himself over the preceding autumn, and it had the slight irregularity of a house built by one man working alone. The door frame not quite plumb, the window on the east wall a little too low. I learned to keep house. I had been learning it all my life, watching my mother, helping her, but now it was mine to do. Cooking, cleaning, washing, mending, the kitchen garden, the chickens, the dairy work with the 2 cows John had bought to start the herd. The work was not unfamiliar. The loneliness was. Not loneliness from John exactly. He was there each evening, and on Sundays we went to church, and sometimes on a Saturday evening neighbors would come by or we would go to them. There was social life of a kind. The loneliness I mean is the loneliness of a mind that has nothing of itself to do. The loneliness of knowing what you want and knowing it is never going to arrive. I was Eliza Crawford now. I had a house and a husband, and before long I would have children, and these things were real and they were mine and I was grateful for them. But underneath them always was the other thing. The thing that had no name in our world, no word for it. The feeling that you were larger than the space you had been given and there was nowhere for the extra part of you to go. John did not know about the letter. I never told him. In the early years of our marriage I thought about telling him many times, but I always stopped myself. Not because I thought he would be cruel about it. John was not a cruel man, but because I knew he would not understand why it still mattered. Why would it matter? He would have thought. That was 2 years ago. You are married now. You have a house. He was not wrong in his way. But he was not right either. Kept teaching myself. In the evenings after John was asleep, I would sometimes sit at the kitchen table with a candle and the account book and write. I had started a new one. Bought it myself with egg money, which was the only money that was considered mine to spend. I filled it slowly, a page or 2 at a time, practicing sentences, practicing spelling, copying passages from whatever I could find to copy from. My spelling was never perfect. It is still not perfect. I never had a teacher long enough for the corrections to fully take hold. When I write a letter now, I can feel the places where the education I never had would have helped me. The hesitation before a word I am not certain of. The sentence I restructure to avoid a spelling I am unsure of. That is a small thing. Most people would say it is a small thing. But it has been my daily reminder for 73 years. Of the letter that burned. The years from 1859 to 1865, from my marriage to the end of the war, were the years in which I became who I am. I do not mean that grandly. I mean that by the time the war ended, I had understood my life clearly enough to stop fighting the shape of it and to find within it what I could find. That is a different thing from acceptance. I never accepted. But there is a way to carry an unhappiness that does not destroy you, and I learned it in those years. My first child was born in 1861. A daughter. I named her Martha. The birth was difficult in ways I will not fully describe except to say that I was attended only by a neighbor woman who had experience of such things, and that there were hours in the night when I was not certain I would survive it. I did survive it. Martha survived it. She was a small, dark-haired baby with very fierce eyes, and from the beginning she seemed to be observing the world with a level of skepticism unusual in an infant. I loved her immediately and completely. When Martha was 4 months old, I began teaching her letters. I know. She was 4 months old. She could not learn letters. But I began anyway, holding her on my lap and pointing to words in the Bible and saying them aloud the way my mother had done with me. Not because I thought she was learning, but because I needed to do it. Because the teaching had to go somewhere and there was only her to teach. Sounds strange, I suppose. But you must understand. The need to teach was part of the same need that had driven me to that school door when I was 9, and to the account book at midnight, and to every borrowed book and every copied sentence. I had been made to teach. That was what the scholarship would have given me the authority to do. Since I had no authority, I did it without authority, quietly in my own house with my own child. By the time Martha was 3, she knew her letters. By 4, she was beginning to read. By 5, she was reading simple Bible passages on her own. I had a second child in 1863, a son, Thomas. I named him for my father because that is what was expected of me, and because whatever I felt about my father privately, it seemed cruel to deny him the naming of his first grandson. Thomas was a different temperament entirely from Martha. Sunny, unserious, interested in animals and outdoor things and not particularly in letters. I taught him too, but without the electric connection I had felt with Martha. He learned because I taught him. She had learned because she wanted to learn. That is a difference you notice. I taught both my children to read and write properly. Not to high levels. I could only take them as far as my own education allowed, and my own education had its gaps and its rough edges. But they could both read with ease by the time they were 6, and they could write letters that made sense, and they knew arithmetic well enough for the farm work they would be asked to do. I should tell you about one particular winter. It was 1862. John was still at home. He did not enlist until the spring of 1863. It was a bad winter, ice and deep cold, and we were more confined than usual to the house. I had been borrowing books from a family in the next valley, the Harringtons, who had more education than most of our neighbors and kept a small shelf of books that they lent freely. I had borrowed a grammar and a book of geography, and that winter I worked through both of them as carefully and completely as I could. The grammar in particular was something I studied the way my father studied the Bible, with attention, rereading, trying to understand not just the rule but the reason behind it. John came in from the barn one evening and saw me at the table with the grammar open and Martha on my lap pointing at words. He looked at the book for a moment. Then he said, "What are you doing with that?" I said, "Teaching Martha her letters." He said, "Huh." And he went to wash his hands. That was all. He never said more than that about it. He was not my father. He had no strong feelings about women and books one way or the other. His world was physical. It was soil and weather and animals and equipment. And what happened inside the house with books was not his concern as long as the house was running well. I was grateful for that, small as it was. It was a form of freedom, even if it was freedom by indifference rather than by respect. But there were evenings, long winter evenings when the children were asleep and John was asleep and the house was silent, when I would sit at the table with the candle and the account book, and I would think about what I could have been. I thought about teaching. I thought about a classroom. I thought about standing at a slate board the way Mrs. Holloway had stood, chalk in hand, children in front of me. Children who would carry what I gave them out into their lives, who would teach their children and their children's children and so on down through time. I thought about it with a longing that did not diminish with the years. That is the cruelest thing about an unrealized ambition. You expect it to fade. You expect that the living of your actual life will eventually fill the space where the other life was. But it does not always. Some things do not fade. Some things simply wait. John enlisted in April of 1863. He was 26 years old. He was not a man with strong political views. He was not a man who talked about the Union or about slavery or about the great questions of the age with any particular feeling. He enlisted because other men in the county were enlisting and it seemed like the thing to do, the thing that was expected of a man of his age and his circumstances, and John Crawford was, above all things, a man who did what was expected of him. He came home to tell me on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands and his eyes a little to the side of mine the way he looked when he was uncomfortable. I did not cry. I said, "When do you leave?" He said, "End of the week." I said, "All right." He was gone for 2 years. He was part of the 140th Pennsylvania Infantry and he was in several engagements. He was at Chancellorsville in May of 1863, which was a disaster for the Union, and he was at Gettysburg in July of that same year, which was not. He came home in the summer of 1865 with a long scar along his left forearm from a bayonet wound, and with a quietness in him that had not been there before. He was not talkative before the war. He was less so after. Those 2 years alone on the farm were the most difficult years of my life, practically speaking. I was 20 years old when he left and 22 when he returned. I had Martha, who was 2, and Thomas, who was born in September of 1863, 5 months after John left. which meant I was already pregnant when he enlisted and I had not yet known it. I managed the farm alone with help from a boy named Owen Haskell, who was 14 and worked for food and a small wage that I could barely afford. I kept the cows milked and the crops in and the house running and the children fed, and I did it without complaint because there was no one to complain to. My sister Catherine was 18 in 1864 and she came to stay with me for 3 months that winter, and those 3 months were the closest we ever were as adults. We talked in a way we had not been able to talk when we were girls. Openly, in the evenings, about things we actually thought and felt. I told her about the letter. For the first time. The whole of it. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "I didn't know." I said, "No one knew except Mother." She was quiet again. And then she said, "Do you hate him for it?" I thought about this carefully. I said, "I don't know if what I feel is hate. I know I have never forgiven the decision." She said, "Is there a difference?" I said, "I hope so." John came home in the summer of 1865. He was thinner and quieter and the scar on his arm was still new enough to be pink. He looked at the farm, at what I had kept running in his absence, and he said, "You did well." That was as much as he ever said about it. We had 2 more children after his return. A daughter, Eleanor, born in 1867, who was fair and small and lived only to age 4 before she died of scarlet fever in the winter of 1871. And a son, Henry, born in 1869, who grew up tall and who farms in Ohio now and has grandchildren of his own. Eleanor's death, she was 4 years old and she was sick for 11 days and then she was gone, was the hardest thing I have ever endured. It makes the loss of a letter seem very small. I want to be honest about that. A child is not a letter. The scale is entirely different. But grief is not a competition and one loss does not cancel another. They sit beside each other. That is all. I kept teaching myself through all of those years. I kept the account books. I filled one and started another. By the time I was in my 30s I had filled 7 of them. My spelling improved, though it never became entirely reliable. My sentences became more ordered. I could write a letter, a real letter to my sister or to a friend, that said what I meant to say in the way I meant to say it. It was not what I had wanted. What I had wanted was a classroom and a slate board and chalk and 30 children looking up at me. But it was something. And something over the years becomes a kind of shelter. My husband John died in 1901. He was 64 years old. It was a stroke. Quick, the doctor said, likely without much pain. He was in the barn when it happened and he was not found until evening. I was 58 years old when he died. I had been Eliza Crawford for 42 years. I did not remarry. There was no need. Martha was grown and nearby, Henry was on the farm, and I had learned long before that I could manage alone. I had managed alone through the war and I could manage alone now. After John died, I had, for the first time in my life, the thing I had never had before. Time. Not the whole days of leisure. There is no such thing on a farm, even in old age. But evenings. Quiet evenings without the obligation of conversation or the awareness of another person's needs. Evenings that were fully mine. I used them for reading. I used them for writing. In 1903 I began writing what I thought of as a record. Not a diary exactly, more a formal account of my life as I remembered it, with attention to accuracy and to getting the sentences right. I wrote slowly and carefully, and I revised what I wrote, and I threw away the pages that embarrassed me by their imprecision and began them again. No one has ever read this record. I have not permitted it. My father died in 1877, as I mentioned. I was 34 years old. I attended his funeral and I stood at his grave in the cold November rain and I felt, what? I have tried to describe it accurately in the pages I have written, and I am not certain I have succeeded yet. It was not grief exactly. It was something more like the closing of an argument that had never had the chance to be spoken. The argument ended before either of us said the thing that needed to be said. He went to his grave not knowing what he had done. I am not certain whether that makes it better or worse. I was asked once, by the minister's wife in our church, a kind woman who had a habit of asking direct questions, whether I had forgiven my father. This was in perhaps 1905. I was 62 years old. I thought about the question for a moment. Then I said, I have forgiven my father, the man who worked hard and feared God and did what he believed was right. I have forgiven him that. She said, and I said, I have not forgiven the decision. The burning. I have tried. But the decision was wrong, and I cannot forgive what was wrong simply because the man who made it is gone." She looked at me with a certain careful expression. Then she said, "The Lord commands us to forgive." I said, "The Lord has a great many years left to convince me on that point." I think about Mrs. Holloway often. Clara Holloway, who wrote a letter on behalf of a 14-year-old girl she had known for 6 weeks. Who took the time and the effort to describe me to an institute she believed could use me. Who asked on my behalf for what she knew I could not ask for myself. I found out what I told you earlier, that she was the one who had written, only in 1898 at a church gathering. She was old by then, in her 70s, her hair white and her hands spotted. She told me she had written the letter and she was sorry it had not worked out, as she put it. That was all. She said it simply, without drama, and then we talked of other things. I drove home alone in the wagon that evening and I cried for the first time in many years. Not only for the letter. For her. For the fact that a stranger had done more for me than my own father, and that it had meant nothing in the end. I am 89 years old. I cannot tell you that the years have softened the feeling about the letter. I can tell you that the years have changed the quality of it. When I was young it was sharp, a bright, specific pain, the pain of fresh loss. Now it is more like a permanent weather. A low pressure that I have learned to live in and that I no longer expect to lift. I have had a life. I want to say that. I have had children and grandchildren, and I have watched this country change in ways that would have been unimaginable to the Thomas Dunn who stood at that fireplace in 1857. Railroads and telegraph lines and automobiles, and now flying machines that carry people from one city to another in the air. My father's world is gone entirely. The world that made his certainties possible is gone. And yet the letter still matters. My granddaughter, Martha's eldest, a girl named Clara, named after Mrs. Holloway at my suggestion, is a teacher. She teaches at a school in Pittsburgh, a proper school with many rooms and many grades, and she has been teaching for 12 years. She tells me things about her students, the difficult ones and the bright ones, and I listen to every word. I would not give those conversations for anything. But I think sometimes when she is telling me about a student who is particularly sharp, particularly hungry, I think, I could have been you. I should have been you. There was a letter. I want to say this for whoever is listening to me now. The letter that was burned was a piece of paper. What it represented was not. What it represented was the chance to spend a life doing what I was made for. That chance was taken from me by a man who believed, genuinely, sincerely, completely, that he was doing what God intended. He said, "The Lord did not intend women for books." I have sat with that sentence for 75 years. I have decided, carefully, slowly, with all the time I have had to think, that my father was wrong. Not in the way that wicked men are wrong. In the way that good men are wrong when the world they were given is too small to contain the truth. The Lord who made my mind made it as it is. Quick and hungry and unable to stop asking what the words mean and how the sentence works and what is at the end of the road I was not allowed to walk down. That is not a sin. That is a gift. A gift that a burning letter could not touch. I never taught school. I never stopped wanting to.